Welcome back to the Daily Drum on WHUR and Sirius XM Channel 141. This is a truncated edition of the Insight segment for Thursday, May 1st. I'm Harold Fisher. Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is calling autism a preventable disease. Last month, the Secretary of Health and Human Services refuted the CDC's past research showing autism has a genetic link and instead claimed it was a preventable disease caused by environmental exposure. The advocacy group Autism Speaks called his comments extremely disappointing and damaging. Well, tonight, we take a brief look at autism, and we're talking to parents and a pediatric expert. My guests are Dr. Marilyn McPherson-Corder. She is a longtime Howard University hospital pediatrician and geneticist. Also, Judith Fitzgerald has a young adult. Gary is 20 years old and high functioning. Robert Montague is also the parent of a son. Xavier is 20 years old and nonverbal. I want to thank you all for sharing in this important conversation.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Here are a few fast facts I want to share with you. Just last year, the CDC estimates that 1 in 31 children in the U.S. has been diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder, or ASD. Now, this is an increase from the previous estimate of 1 in 36 children. Now, additionally, 1 in 45 adults in the U.S. are estimated to have autism. Dr. Corder, I want to start with you. How would you characterize the increased numbers? Are there actually more cases, or do you believe they were actually only doing a better job of detecting autism spectrum disorder?
Absolutely. All of the above. You know, autism is about 70 years old now when we talk about when we first started talking about autism in the 1950s. And unfortunately, during that time, that 10-year, people who had the symptoms of autism, which was nonverbal, what they call non-learnable, they would institutionalize them.
Mm-hmm.
And that was it. And unfortunately, during that time, the delayed echolalia, the extreme deficit in social behaviors, they thought, okay, well, they can't be educated. So in the 50s and 60s, we saw what they at that time said was 1 in 10,000. All right. So now follow me with this quick flow chart. So then in the 60s, many people with autism not only were institutionalized, they just weren't studied. They were not looked at in terms of what can they do? Is there a variety of learning? And they just were the throwaway population. In the 70s, then the incident, instead of 1 in 10,000, was 1 in 2,000 in the 70s. That was when I was in medical school. And they blamed it on, it was called they were the invisible population. And then they would say, well, because they were born to cold mothers who weren't loving. So that was one of the theories. But in the 80s, they began to understand, and that's when autism children who lacked interest in people who were nonverbal, they began to really take a better look. And they were no longer institutionalized, but they were part of the family. And that incident in 87 was like 1 in 1,400. So we go from 1 to 10,000 to 1 in 1,400, because we then began as a people began to respect and understand and at least begin to study autism. Now, it was in the 90s that children who had developmental delays, we call it neurodevelopmental dysfunction or delay. And that's what autism is, ASD, autism spectrum disorder. And I'm so glad it's the spectrum as opposed to what we used to think autism in the corner rocking and not communicating at all, no interest in people and relationships. But the doctors, we began to identify insurances were beginning to be mandated to have therapy. And the educational department began to say, well, we should do something. These are children who have special needs. So we saw an increase, major increase in the incident, because people were coming outside the class. They were like, okay, my child has this. They often were in denial. Everyone had a family member that may have had a little special, couldn't really talk much. And he was just special. That's what they called it. Wasn't calling it retarded, but just special. But now it's like, we can help these children. These children are not to be pushed aside. They're intelligent. And I'm going to talk later about how intelligent they really are.
Well, let me ask you this also briefly, Doctor, before I get to both Judith and Robert. What are your thoughts about what RFK Jr. is saying about it being preventable and that it has to do with environmental factors?
Well, one thing, it's not due to vaccines. And, that's been debunked. Environmental factors, I'll say this, unless the child is premature or have some toxicity that will affect their brain, that might look like autism. But we're now beginning to see 90 to 95% of autism is genetic. So as a geneticist, what I have begun to study are the parents, the uncles, the grandparents, and they still, as they were coming up, they were a little quirky. They had a little bit of socialization deficits, some language delay, and we putting it together.
Judith, tell us about Gary. How did you first discover that ASD was an issue with him?
It's interesting. I had him in daycare with a daycare provider, and she made a comment to me about his behavior. And she said, if I were you, I would get him looked at. And that's the way she poses. She said, have him looked at. So when we left her care, not necessarily because of that comment, but just because of it was a situation that presented itself that way he could go somewhere else, he went to another daycare center. Same issue. And my son, unfortunately, was like almost kicked out of like 2 daycare centers. It wasn't until he got to the last one that we became familiar with an organization. And gosh, of course, I'm going to forget it now that I'm on a live stream. I think it's called Abilities Network. And they came in and they observed him. And then they did an assessment, and they were the ones who thought that he might be on the autism spectrum. From there, he went to Catholic Charities, and from Catholic Charities to Kennedy Krieger, where he was officially diagnosed as being on the autism spectrum.
Robert, talk to me about your family's parenting journey with Xavier.
It's been difficult and very educational. Xavier was diagnosed in a similar way to yours, Ms. Fitzgerald. Actually, his pediatrician, he was a very good pediatrician. Pediatrician, I think he was checking Xavier's milestones and how he was just seeing his development, right? And I remember one day he said, I think Xavier might be on the autism spectrum. And we were like, wow. And that sent us on our journey. Kennedy Krieger, Shepherd Pratt, the usual stops for people who have children who are on the spectrum or even adults. But he didn't have the problems in daycare as much as he did in elementary school. He went through, I think, 2 elementary schools before he ended up going to the Forbush Center and then on to Linwood, where he is now. But it's been very difficult. Xavier's probably his biggest hurdle is his I don't want to say lack of communication, his inability to express himself. And I think that has led to his aggression, which is the biggest thing that holds him back. When you're a person who has major meltdowns and you're physically harming people, it really restricts how people can help you. But it's been a long journey. He's getting there. I always tell people that he's doing the best he can and he's getting there, but it's a process, because he's communicating better, and that seems to have helped him regulate his behavior a little more. He's getting a little bit easier to understand, or it seems like people are understanding him better. The reports that we get from the people that work with him. But it's been a journey. His progress has been very incremental.
Judith, what is Gary doing now? As I said in the beginning, he is high functioning, and
Right.
full
Right.
disclosure. I mean, to our listeners, both Judith and Robert are my decades-long friends, so I know them exceptionally well. And in talking with you, Judith, we've spoken over the past about his many successes. So where is he now?
Yeah, he like Robert's son, Xavier, the majority of a lot of the hurdles in Gary's progression were behavioral, because my son is not only ASD, but he's also ADHD and ODD.
Mm.
And so when he was first in elementary school, he was put in a behavioral program and quickly, fortunately, elevated to a general ed program. By the time he got to high school, he was in the biomedical sciences program and actually received his white coat as a doctor. So he's, physics, chemistry,
Oh.
Trigonometry. I mean, oh, that's easy, Mom. I mean, that kind of kid. Now he's at CCBC, which is where I work. And he's into computers, which a lot of ASD kids are into computers, particularly games. And he wants to become a game developer. So he's taking up courses in C++ programming right now. And it's just really interesting. Before I came here to CCBC, and still at the moment, I am also a professor. And I teach in master's and doctoral programs. And one thing I noticed about my son, when he was in high school, he was writing on a level that was, in my opinion, was just as advanced as a doctoral student. And I remember when I was attending a session when he was in elementary school, he was I think he was in first grade. They tested him, and he tested on a 6th grade level for vocabulary and math. So he's always been up there. And when I speak to him and talk to him, I feel like I'm talking to an older adult. But his main issues are behavioral and executive functioning.
I see. Dr. Corder, talk to me briefly about what you're hearing. This is, I think, a prime example of children. They're always going to be children to us, obviously, our children. But you talk about the various levels of the spectrum.
Absolutely. What Judith is what she just expressed, many of my patients experience. We have 2 and 3-year-olds who can decode the phone. They are computer. They may not be so social. They may not realize you're in the room, or they act like they don't. But as a geneticist, I've done sessions with them, and I've told the parents, let's find that beam. Let's find that light in that brain, where I always say, where there may be some deficit, as in social and interactive, there's another part of that brain that excels exceedingly. And that's why Silicon Valley has special jobs for children who have autism, because they're not going to get the water cooler, shooting the breeze. They're going to be coding, they're going to be on the computers, etc. We also know that they're very interested in music, as well as singing and dance. They're artsy. So they play the piano often by ear, and they dance and they sing. Many children who are not so verbal, they're verbal when they begin to sing, and different songs. You'll hear my patients say, we saw Miss Rachel. We have to play this to distract them. They'll come in my exam room and they're all over the place and humming and self-stimming. But then when we put music on, something they like, they stop, and you get their attention. And we have to maximize on that. I tell everybody to find their talent. The 2 or 3 of them. Don't just say they can't learn, because they can outlearn you.
Yeah. Dr. Corder, earlier this week, the Prince George's County Police Department reported on the successful location and rescue of, I believe it was an 8-year-old boy who was on the autism spectrum, who was nonverbal. And there were comments that were made about children who are on the spectrum and that they are attracted to water. Can you,
Right.
what is that about?
It's it's interesting. It's self-soothed. And when you're laying back, let's say you're on your back, it's self-soothed. And that's that stimulation because they have they're sensitive with stimuli. But water tends to be their best friend. And we've seen that. I know with my relatives, with my grandchild, she likes water. She's taught herself to swim. But we have to make sure as they're wandering, and hopefully they're not, that they know how to swim. So
because he was actually rescued from a small lake.
Right.
Oh my goodness.
That's where they found him.
Oh
They're
my God.
He was waist deep
Oh.
in water, standing still, and they were able to locate him through heat detection methods from a helicopter. He was, other than his body temperature being lower in the lower half of his body than the upper half, obviously, because he was in cold water at night. But other than that, he was perfectly fine. And so for those people who are listening who don't understand the correlation between children on the autism spectrum and water, because suffice it to say, even for those of us who are not on the spectrum, everybody likes a bath.
Right.
You know, everyone likes to put their feet, in the water, on the beach or what have you. So it does make sense. I did want to ask you, and this is for both Judith and Robert, and actually you too, Dr. Corder, because you mentioned that your granddaughter, who is 5, is also on the spectrum. But I'll ask you first, Robert, and this is about parenting. What advice would you give to parents who are experiencing this kind of complication in their family as to how do you do it?
In retrospect, I think that one of the most important things is getting the diagnosis, an actual formal diagnosis as early as you can. And from there, it's making yourself aware of the programs that are out there, the organizations that are out there, the things that I haven't done that I really should have done, like support groups, things like that. But getting that diagnosis, getting an actual formal diagnosis as soon as you can, or as soon as you start to have questions, teachers and doctors are going to tell you things, teachers and the doctors are going to tell you things. People that see your children at daycare, whatever, they'll see things, they'll see behaviors or whatever, and just act on that as soon as possible. Because our pediatrician, he was just all over it. Looking back, I don't even know how he came to that so quickly. So the diagnosis, get that.
Judith, same question. What advice would you give to parents?
Yeah, Robert's right. The diagnosis is the first step. Also, I did get in support groups. I had to. It's tough being a parent of a child on the spectrum, particularly a child with behavioral issues. And they can be abusive, verbally and physically. So
through no fault of their own.
Yeah,
Right.
through no fault of their own. I mean, it's their disability. And that's the thing that, keeps me awake at night. My son has said to me that he's not ready to drive yet. And I'm actually kind of happy about that, because I would hate for him to get involved with law enforcement. I mean, what would happen? I've been involved in several cases where there's been mothers whose children have been involved with law enforcement and have been incarcerated because law enforcement, they haven't quite received the training that is necessary to deal with a young adult on the spectrum. And they don't understand. So, I would say get the diagnosis first. Also, if you're in the state of Maryland, make sure you get on that Maryland waiver program.
What's the Maryland waiver?
It's a program that you sign up for. You should sign up for it as soon as you get the diagnosis. It gives you community-based services and resources up until the child turns 21.
Mhm.
And in some instances, residential situations, because a lot of parents of children on the spectrum, the kids don't live with them. They have to live in a residential um, uh, um, program. Of course, Gary has always been with me, but I've always gotten. I belong to. There's a blog. There's a guy who's a father, and he has 3 sons, and all 3 of them are on the spectrum.
My goodness. Yeah.
And he writes this blog, which is very, very therapeutic, because you say to yourself, you read the material, and you're like, oh my gosh, I'm not alone.
Yeah.
He's going through the same thing I'm going through, and that's helpful. It's really helpful.
Yeah. Well, and for those who are listening, Judith did mention cases. She's also a lawyer, which we didn't mention at the top of the program for those who may have caught something that she said just then. I did want to let you have the last word in these last handful of minutes, Dr. Corder. You're a grandmother of a child on the spectrum, but you're also a physician, as I said, geneticist. What do you want to tell parents who may be concerned, they may be expecting? What's the best advice that you can share?
So now with the American Academy of Pediatrics, we test between 18 to 24 months. And we have to make sure that as we are screening, that we're honest with the parents and we very clear for them to continue to make sure all the services, as Judith mentioned as well, wherever you live. Now, I have over the past 30 years respected autism so much, because with a lot of my patients they can tell you everything about coding, etc. And so when it hits you in your face and you're like, maybe it's because of COVID, because we were all enclosed with COVID and socialization was minimized. But then when certain things, the developmental milestones after a certain age kind of slowed down, even though she reads, she reads like a 10th grader, she reads, but in terms of that socialization. And then you're like, okay, here's what we do. First of all, that brain is still yet developing and is very bright already. Instead of, oh my goodness, you want to say, what can we do? How can we have that child maximally learn? Because they're very high IQ. And and we see that. They may be awkward socially. They may be a little aggressive because maybe they can't express what they want to say is here, but it's not expressive. But to maximize that, and to really now begin to appreciate our differences, appreciate what the spectrum is. And it is a spectrum. And I tell folks, individualize that. Celebrate the positives. Don't home in on only the negative, but individualize that. They're athletes, they're dancers, they're musicians, they're coders. That brain is there. We just have to make sure we maximize on that brain. Now, there was a comment made earlier. ADHD is the first cousin of autism. So they're busy. Okay, there's a lot of anxiety.
Right.
But ADHD patients are very bright. Individuals are very bright.
Right.
We all know them. Many of us are them. But you have to make sure that you understand what we call normal. There's no normal now. And that normal we need to accept not only as educators, but as parents.
I think that's a great place to end this conversation. I want to thank all of you, Dr. Marilyn McPherson Corder, Robert Montague, Judith Fitzgerald, particularly you two. As I said, we've been friends for years, and I know this is a highly personal and very sensitive conversation. So I really thank you all for coming on and talking about this. I appreciate it.
All right.
No, I appreciate it.
That is the Daily Drum for this Thursday, May 1st. I'm Harold Fisher. Coming up, The Original Quiet Storm with Raheem Devon. That's on WHUR. Good night.